You are about to receive downloaded content. Subscribe to our newsletter for exclusive transmission straight to your inbox. Go to downloadedcontent.com to follow us on your platform of choice.
This piece of literature will be exclusively for Pneumatics, as you are the only audience that I'm sure can receive it. This being the case, your humble author, narrator, and fictional character is forced to accept that only a minority of eyes will have made it past the first sentence. There will be no qualifiers here to allow you to ascertain whether you are a pneumatic or not. You either know you are or are no longer reading. In any case, let us begin. Not too long ago, I finally entered the world of Grand Theft Auto 5 on my faithful yet aging PlayStation 4, as it was the last simulated world on my shelf that I had avoided immersing myself in. One has to be in the right mindset to embody that kind of controlled shadow work, and while it took me years to get into it, I was very thankful once I did. As anyone who has played a Rockstar game knows, they spare no attention to detail in the vast, simulated worlds they craft, and when it comes to the criminal underworld, a certain type of darkness is required to fully invest in the story. And make no mistake, for yours truly, it is always about story. I'm not one of those pretentious completionists that needs 100% in every trophy of dopamine that can be obtained. No, once I know how the story ends for the characters I've invested in, the eject button is finally pressed on the disc, containing all the data of the reality I had lost myself in. Thus, after the credits rolled and the game allowed me free reign over the world I had lived in for 40 plus hours, I sat there with the controller in my hand, wondering what to do with Trevor, Michael, and Franklin. While there were plenty of side quests, activities, and lively NPCs left to keep my avatars busy in Los Santos for hours upon hours post plot, something about the world simply felt dead. I could still race all over the sprawling city and bring chaos to the inhabitants of that digital world inside the box on my TV stand with just as much fervor as before I knew how it all ended for the main protagonist. But it just didn't feel as gratifying. It just seemed like I would be going through the motions each time I powered it up, and that was no fun. This has been the experience of pneumatics on planet Earth for the past few years as well, when logging into the skin suits we wear each rising sun. The world at large is still filled with mundane tasks to be carried out and a never ending sea of Hylic faces we interact with, but something of substance has been missing as of late, and I would suggest it's the same issue I found with GTA 5 upon its storyline completion. There is no further progression of plot for we protagonists who came here for a higher evolution than the Hylics who hang on apocalyptic edging from every screen they stare into and every platform that continually convinces them that it's about to be the end of the world as they know it each and every day. An Armageddon that never actually arrives, mind you. Nevertheless, this end of the world edging keeps them scrolling, swiping up again and again to get just a few more tidbits on the inevitable collapse of the economy or the coming nuclear holocaust or the draft that will turn 82% of their children into hamburger meat in the Middle East. Every 24-hour news cycle keeps them close to the climax of oblivion, but never allows the release that keeps building underneath the flesh. Those of us of a Gnostic persuasion are hip to this game the system is playing. We aren't mystified by the harvesting of emotional energy, commonly called louche, by those in the know. We are aware that there is never meant to be any kind of solution or conclusion to the prepackaged issues of the day that assault our senses through whichever curated app might best pull us into the illusion of the consensus reality whose tracks were laid a very long time ago by a Demiurge and its emanations known as the Archons. Yet even with this full revelation of the method being held by the students of the non-commodity scrolls, there still seems to be the feeling of frustration or confusion by the psychics with an expectation of some big final spiritual thingamajig that also, like the experience of the Hylics, never actually comes. As they await a conclusion to the physical problems they are bound by, the psychics are being edged in a metaphysical loop also, with a distinct and separate form of energy harvesting they are completely unaware of for the most part. Don't get me wrong. As a pneumatic who sparked up to seek Sophia on the path of Gnosis many, many moons ago, long before YouTube algorithms were saturated with Sethian or Valentinian teachings that show up on your feed as breaking news, I am more than excited that at long last the time Enoch saw in his visionary travels is upon us. It brings me much joy as a Gnostic who had to hide his research or experiences while digging for any scrap of the non commodity library he could get his hands on, while living behind the enemy lines of the Bible Belt, that terms such as Demiurge, Archons, or Pleroma are becoming commonplace. My spirit swells up with optimism to hear that swaths of souls are now discovering that the generic narrative of the biblical God is the great deception to the 180th degree. I'm overjoyed psychics are realizing that the father that Christ Yeshua spoke of was not the douche from the Old Testament who loved a good genocide from time to time. Rather, was that old serpent the devil that corporate Christians kneel before to this day. Yet, in the midst of this Gnostic revival, I have perceived the perilous approach of religiosity being applied by more than a few, which causes me pause. Allow me to explain what I mean. One evening, while flicking through countless faces of content creators, I came across a guy giving a breakdown of Yaldabaoth and his archons, and in an uncharacteristic of me move, I decided to leave a comment. In that comment, I casually relayed that while his information was well researched and presented, the Demiurge had been deposed circa 2017 and the blind god was no longer throwing temper tantrums upon his throne. And while outdated and bound to texts written some 2,000 years ago, the cosmic order had naturally moved on from that. In no way was I expecting to be believed or taken seriously by any measure, and it would have had no consequence to me one way or the other anyway. I was simply nudged to be flippant in the dropping of such gnosis in a meaningless comment section for purposes of amusement more than anything else. Or, to be more accurate, I did it just to see what would happen, with as much seriousness as a Joker variant getting his jollies. Then, a response from the content creator was deposited the next day, after more than a few other users had their curiosity tickled. With a very defensive dialogue toward his followers away from my folly, he insisted they not listen to a word from my digital pen. With a tonality of authority on the subject matter of gnosis, he reassured his imaginary flock that my ramblings were heretical to the source material he was teaching in his content creation, and the concepts of the Demiurge, the Archons, and their energy harvesting racket were to always be taken in a metaphorical manner and never approached with perhaps a literal manner. This, he proclaimed, is the appropriate application of Gnosticism, which, of course, is the dumbest shit ever, as it turns the open door to being a participant in the cosmic order into an invitation to make yet another dogmatic religion based on scriptures written thousands of years ago that no one can alter or abolish. Even the suggestion of there being heresy in Gnosticism is an affront to what Gnosticism even is. The content creator's approach to the material handed down to us by our forebears in the Gnostic path is solely a psychological one, and hey, that's fine for him, and fine for any other Gnostic that chooses to experience the information in a purely psychological way as well. If their firsthand experience of acquiring the knowledge they hold at present facilitates an interpretive view only of such personalities as Yaldabaoth, Sophia, Christ, Enoch, or any other name one might find in their readings, then for them this is true. But if the core of Gnosticism is in fact the acquiring of knowledge through firsthand personal experience, then who is he to look down his nose at yours truly, if in my gnosis of these personalities, they are in fact individual consciousnesses that can be interacted with, do have a progressive storyline, and their storylines have stayed static for the past 2,000 or so years. The denunciation of a pneumatic's current awareness of cosmic events unfolding in our day has the potential to reduce Gnosticism to the same type of impotency suffered by corporate Christianity or other religions that do not offer active participation in the scenarios they present as the highest reality. When Gnosticism begins gatekeeping what experiences are or are not canon, then it ceases to be Gnosticism at all. This is a tragedy for a system that is unique in that it is the very narrow gate Christ told us about, a gate in which we can enter into the narrative of events and indeed become more than one of the NPC high-lit backdrop people one finds in, say, Grand Theft Auto 5, with full capacity to not only interact with the cosmic narrative, but manipulate as well as rewrite by our actions. Gnosticism is the path of becoming player one ourselves, not just reading about others who became player one by insisting we all can become player one and demonstrating this liberation through action of will. I think this is where the tripartite tractate is essential reading in order to digest where I'm going with this. If you've read it, then the odds are high that you have not simply accepted that 82% of the people populating this plane are Hylics, bound to matter without capacity to ascend any further, but you have experienced this as well. The tractate usually comes into your awareness afterwards to put some literal structure into your actual experience. After the experience of accepting this, you then go back to the drawing board on exactly how you were even supposed to be playing this game. I mean, if the majority of people you perceive are photonic projections of the system itself in a variety of coding, then certain aspirations in life are no longer viable, meaningful, or desirable. Achievements such as fortune, fame, or virility in virtual spaces are clearly pointless, as what they're trying to achieve is akin to what the Demiurge was trying to achieve, forcing the system itself to bend, bow, validate, and worship like a reflection of the ego. Boring. As a pneumatic, your attention is drawn towards what the object of our game is. Psychics, those being weighed in the balance of free will and system imposed karmic debt. You no longer waste your time or energy attempting to change or save the world of Hylics with its endless illusions in theaters of politics, religion, or Hollywood gossip. No, to experience fulfillment again, you contract yourself inward to the truth of there being far, far less conscious sparks able to change or be saved, participating at all in this lobby of reality. As a pneumatic, the object of the game is to assist those psychic sparks still stuck in their cycles of samsara, whose ultimate ending has yet to be determined in the pleroma, due to them having been gifted with free will. In the edification of psychics and aiding them in some way to shine that Sophia within brighter and brighter, a mnemonic once again finds purpose. By performing our mission parameters from the monad with clarity, eagerness, and joy, we do experience the bliss of meaning in our own reality once again, post long dark nights of the soul that usually comes with any kind of awakening, Gnostic or otherwise. Using Grand Theft Auto 5 as the word picture again for reference to the state of affairs in our own simulation, regardless of how you play the game, the hundreds of thousands of NPCs that permeate through the city of Los Santos are wonderful for liminal states of immersion, but you know you are nowhere near as invested in their well-being as you are for the three playable avatars. Heck, there are even quite a few side characters that are coded with far more dialogue and interactivity than NPCs who you become quite partial to as well. The difference between them and the rest of the Hylics being the quality of good writing and the nature of their characters. Even though none of them are able to actually connect with the player in any synchronous interface like Trevor, Franklin, or Michael, you know they are special. They have much more spark than the hooker on the corner waiting to hop in Trevor's truck, you could say. So why, for we pneumatics, have the past few years felt like we've beaten the game? Why does it seem that even the storyline for psychics has come to the event horizon of a singularity, where time doesn't seem to be moving forward very much at all, yet does at the same time? In 2026, when Gnostic cosmology and concepts are more available than they have ever been, and the con game of the archons and their demiurge is on the lips of multitudes, why are we pneumatics perceiving this place as a looped modal? In that looped modal, progress has been snipped and stitched in a very small Ouroboros. Why does the game world feel dead? To perhaps pursue an answer to these questions, the aforementioned content creator's heresy must be performed, and we pneumatics must consider that not only are the Gnostic texts able to pull back the veil in regard to the psychological order, but do so as well in the cosmic order. If we have accepted the invitation by the Logos that reached out to us through the scriptures first and entered into the events transpiring all around us, which the Nag Hammadi translated to us, we experience the ongoing spherical saga within its many layers. While the text gave us the backstory of where we are, what we are, why we are, and a cast of cosmic characters that ultimately must be interacted with to get anywhere, it's a safe bet to say that we didn't enter the game in the beginning, as it were. This being the case, any pneumatic worth their salt is going to want to brush up on recent events in realms unseen, and that is only going to be done through the medium of first-hand experiential acquisition of gnosis, with perhaps a dash of comparing some others' notes. The Gnostic Seeker's Library should obviously have the best translations of the Nag Hammadi scrolls on their shelf, but I would also insist that beside them rest scriptures most might not include in pursuit of their gnosis in the writings of Douglas Adams. In my experience, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series has every right to be considered as the lifting of the cosmic veil as well. The theme I wish to bring to your mind in the pursuit of our questions on why the simulation feels like a repeating, self regurgitating script for Pneumatics lately is that of the restaurant at the end of the universe. Not the entirety of the book itself, but in the concept of this restaurant that utilizes the end of all things as ambience for fine dining. If you haven't read the book, no worries, I'll be brief in bringing you up to speed and promise no spoilers. After the events of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, our beloved protagonists feel a bit peckish and opt to have their meal at Millieways, the restaurant at the end of the universe, a wondrous and highly improbable dining facility with a unique form of entertainment for its patrons, far surpassing anything you would witness at a buffet in Las Vegas. When customers arrive at Millieways, the restaurant itself travels through time to the actual end of all things, the end of the universe itself. Diners have a panorama view from the comforts of their seats and quality of their cuisine of everything in all the universe that we know of coming to its ultimate and catastrophic ending outside the windows of this restaurant that returns them back to their own time after they've had their dinner and a show. Due to the time paradox Millie Way utilizes, they accept reservations from all over the galaxy to essentially treat their customers to the same show each night, only to return them safely where they began with no lasting consequences after having treated the end of the universe as yet another streaming service. Not even universal annihilation is safe from being turned into a commodity by entrepreneurs in the cosmos of Douglas Adams, who, through his genius sarcasm, probably got more about life, the universe, and everything correct than any of your theologians ever could. Something similar is going on with psychics, but instead of them all being transported through time to the same apocalyptic event at a specific point in the future, multiple Armageddons are being offered to them at a digital buffet they hold in the palm of their hands on a daily basis, utilizing psychics as servers, feeding them a plethora of end-of-the-world scenarios to add energy and imagination to. The system has them maintaining this redundant reality they, as well as we pneumatics, find ourselves currently experiencing. A wide variety of end-of-the-world scenarios burning into their retina as breaking news as fast as they can swipe, but never the actual culmination of the oblivion teased, nor the consequences that would come afterward. It's a well-cast net, too, able to catch psychics at various stages of their process through this system we called soul. For those who have yet to reach the point of evolution where it's known that anything political or geopolitical is scripted and unable to be affected by participation, the flesh and blood remnants of Yaldabaoth and Donald Trump host the World War III nuclear holocaust show. Yet, for psychics who have moved beyond that level, there is still plenty to choose from in Tales of Disclosure, AI Armageddons, missing or dead scientists working on free energy, Schumann resonance megabursts, Orwellian police state establishments, reptile pedophile cannibal cults running everything, the invasion of extraterrestrial interdimensional entities that are poking through thanks to the brains over at CERN, and any other big spiritual thingamajig that's causing the woo-woos to shift timelines every other full moon. It's always about to happen, but never shall the top pop in a happy ending of the epoch. This apocalypse edging is very frustrating for pneumatics, especially if you haven't solved the how or the why. In an endeavor to discover these solutions for my own personal gnosis, I stick to the maxim of, man, know thyself, and you will know the worlds and their gods. For pneumatics who comprehend that in a holographic universe, the smallest parts contain the whole, accessing the how and why of things is as simple as knowing your own personal journey, your own story, your own first-hand experiences on the path of gnosis. With honest eyes and adequate memory, you can get a pretty good grasp on outward events by having a decent recall of your inner origins. That being said, in an attempt to relay from me to you the explanations of how and why psychics are being subjected to these loops and we pneumatics are caught in their wake, it is needful for me to tell you the story of how a deck of tarot cards ripped my brain in two. After escaping organized religion and hearing the call of Sophia circa 2012, my hunger for knowledge outside the confines of the corporate Christian text was simply insatiable. What had once been fear of even considering reading things outside of the 66 accepted books of the Bible was replaced with an addiction to examine any and all texts I could get my hands on. Line upon line and precept upon precept, the synchronicity game did what it does and placed before me books scriptures, or information that at first examination would have appeared random or unrelated. Yet, as we pneumatics know, there is no random acquisition of knowledge. Gnosis comes to us curated by the cosmos and in an exact order unique to our station in the process of evolution. There is no set curriculum for pneumatics. Rather, it is very much like a social media algorithm and custom to us as individuals. By the time I picked up my first Rider-Waite tarot deck, eager to explore, my path had built a firm foundation on the general concepts of Gnosticism that, while very right brain, was still primarily a head knowledge. Looking back, I can affirm that while the Nag Hammadi texts gave me orientation of what a life in mysticism could be, it was the tarot that opened the door to the application of that information and flung me head first into the reality of it. Tarot was the key that unlocked the door between myself as a spectator to the goings on of the unseen and the Gnostics before me, who became active participants in the ongoing drama just behind the thinnest of veils. Every tarot reader has their own system, I'm sure. Many simply consult the cute little booklet that comes with a deck they buy from the metaphysical shop to determine a spread meaning. As for myself, having completed Carl Jung's Man and His Symbols prior to flipping through my first deck and applying the wise advice of the Oracle of Delphi, it was not needful for me to memorize the many interpretations of every card. No, again, all I needed was to know myself. Through that lens, each card's meaning was whatever memory it pulled from my story. Each image or symbol only needed to speak to what I, through my life, had firsthand experiential knowledge of. Grasping the tarot is not a matter of knowing what the cards mean as much as knowing what the cards mean to me. After you get that down pat, you once again bring to mind that in a holographic universe, the smallest parts contain the whole. So superimposing a spread you understand yourself onto others is a cakewalk. Tarot is holding up multiple mirrors to the reader of their inner world, their deepest secrets, their most repressed memories, desires, fears, hopes, and subconscious secrets. This is happening regardless of whether the reader is aware or not, which is why picking up the tarot can be a dangerous game for most and has indeed pushed many a novice or casual reader off the cliff of psychosis or insanity. I've seen it happen many times in my career as a mystic. If a reader cannot be true to themselves or honest about their inner world and workings, the tarot can become malware of the mind and inflict tremendous amounts of damage. This is probably why there's so much superstition and taboo to the tarot by religionists, though rather than science and psychology being the cause, they would attribute demonic influence on these cases. During my days digging into the occult and coming in contact with a multitude of metaphysical muckabouts, I can name more than a few instances where a witch or otherwise in the woo-woo community completely flew off the rails after a reading or two. They would be suspicious their significant other was cheating on them, or some other practitioner was doing black magic against them, bucking for their position at work, or stealing from them in some way. They would shuffle the deck, throw out some cards, and based on their misunderstanding of what the cards are, would completely lock into a reality that outside of the reading they had no tangible logical proof was the actual nature of the circumstances they found themselves in. In many of these cases where the querent would do this sort of thing, you could see the twinkle of psychosis in their eyes, and nothing you said from then on could convince them that perhaps these things were not so. Nevertheless, they were locked in, and that reality they misread on face value from the tarot might as well, for them, have been actual reality. Shortly thereafter, you could almost hear the bubble of sanity in their skull pop before they flamed their life out in some disastrous way, not understanding that the cards weren't exactly telling them the answers to questions they were asking, but the inner truths of questions they were afraid to ask about themselves. In my experience, tarot is doing something physical in the brain, not in some malevolent way with intentions of its own. Tarot is like any tool, science or technology, in that it's neutral. Electricity, when handled properly and wired with care, can light up your home and supply energy to all your favorite modern devices. When handled irresponsibly, it can kill, maim, or as my daddy used to say, it'll knock your dick string loose, son. The same principle applies to tarot and the intentions of whoever is doing the reading. A charlatan, after your money, can shuffle you a fairy story that makes you more eager to part with your cash without regard to any dangerous neural connections their presentation may have wired together in your noodle. And in my experience, this is the physical change occurring within a brain. Neural connections are being wired and fired together when we view symbols as ancient as those in most decks of tarot. This is especially potent when we're discussing symbols on an epigenetic level of the collective unconscious. Symbols that, while they may be unfamiliar to the conscious mind, are written in the genetic coding of our unconscious going back generations upon generations. Again, to get a better understanding of what I'm saying, you really do want to pick up a copy of Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung. This recommendation is even more beneficial if you're messing with tarot in any form. Moving forward, I'll just assume you have and continue to explain why my experience indicates there is certainly a physical component to its usage. In my pursuit of gnosis, which would allow me to poke my head through the veil of this plane and see the gears, pulleys, and ropes of the play backstage, like the guy in the Flammarion engraving, the year 2012 had me balancing the fourfold nature. I was doing the work, as they say, intending to my emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical bodies through multiple practices. Meditation was a must. Yoga, breathing techniques, solar gazing, eliminating meat from my diet, flooding my body with alkalinity in any way I could get it. These were all efforts I was making to not just read about the life Christ Yeshua promised us, but to embody that life, having taken him at his word. A life where metaphysics and miracles were the primary experience and not just daydreams. And it was working. Little by little, the other side was pushing through in all the wondrous ways you hear about. Synchronicity was accelerating. Thoughts and feelings were bending the simulation in very notable ways. Encounters of just the right people at just the right times were becoming commonplace. My physical body pulsed with an electric current that the more alkaline I became, and everything I touched was turning to gold. The tale of Paulo Coelho's alchemist was becoming the cliff notes of my experience. But that wasn't enough. I wanted more than manifestation for good parking spaces and bumps in the bank account. I wanted to pierce the veil and walk the worlds of angels, demons, and everything in between. I wanted to sit with Enoch and nod with a mutual understanding of the magnitude of creation, but having only known the world we are all presented with up until then, I had no way to prepare myself for exactly what that meant. Then one day, the other side poked through first to me. I was sitting in an old wooden chair by the window of an apothecary I frequented, having a conversation with the peculiar shop owner who had come into my story just weeks prior as he sat beside me. I could write a multitude about this man alone in the context of our current subject matter, but unless you are really cool with a lot of things that David Icke has to say, this is not the time or place for such an exposition. Let's just say this peculiar and very old shopkeeper was somewhat of a metaphysical character himself, though he made most of his communication wrapped in enigmas, riddles, and codes. He knew way more regarding the supernatural than he would ever say, but if he found you a worthy seeker, he was fond of dropping key clues to put you on an esoteric Easter egg hunt that could keep you quite busy, or get you killed. This particular day, as he was speaking to me in his usual slow cadence, till he stopped mid-sentence. His eyes became transfixed off in the distance for a moment, and for a short time he didn't move. When animation returned to him, his body language was out of character. His gaze was intent, and his words were very unlike the man I had come to know. He began saying things to me that had no relevance to what we had previously been speaking about, but it was with a sense of urgency. And while I listened, I couldn't help but feel a cold familiarity coming from him, or the presence of someone I had known a very long time ago. Someone who had done great injury to me when I was a child, but who had been murdered in their jail cell before they could ever attempt an amends with me in this life. The more he spoke, the more details of things only I and the deceased could even possibly know. And while I sat in that chair, listening, my mind was racing to process exactly what was going on. After the old man finished speaking, he asked me for forgiveness and confessed he had been living in hell, which, coming from the shopkeeper, was completely out of sorts. The words only made sense if they were coming from someone who'd been dead and buried in an unmarked grave for 20 years, and of course, what kind of crazy would that be, right? After this brief exchange and my response to his request, the old man once again looked off into the distance as if something was leaving him, and shortly after shook his head back into his awareness, as if he had been gone altogether. Confused, he looked back at me with his normal body language and speech to ask where we had left off in our conversation. The entire episode truly was bizarre and left me with a multitude of questions whose answers could only lead me to some even more bizarre places. In this instance, I felt it prudent to pursue these answers in the tarot nearly as soon as I returned back to my abode. Looking back, it is apparent to me that had I simply ran a spread of cards alone, it would not have happened. Rather, the combined efforts of multiple practices in my journey is what precipitated the following event. It was the buildup in all four bodies that brought me to the threshold that evening where enough pressure was pushing up against my pineal that the smallest crack in the dam would release the flood. The crack was the question that I had, which might seem fitting in a horror movie, but is an altogether different experience when you're forced to ask it in your own life if a dead person was just talking to you through the members of someone else. This is an experience that, if confirmed or reasonably supported enough by your own senses, is a paradigm shift of paradigm shifts. A reality you have lived up to before being forced to ask such things is a proverbial rug begging to be pulled out from underneath you and all that you thought was possible. Yet I already knew the answer. I had experienced communication between myself and someone else that could have only possibly happened if my speculation of what had occurred was the truth. The words exchanged with the details that draped them was only a possibility if somehow or another the spirit of a person who had left this realm in the flesh decades prior managed to borrow the body of another to say what they had to say with the one person who could or would understand them. But it's always nice to have a second opinion. The cards were run, and as each fell to the fifth, it was like the chiming of bells on an etheric cathedral warning midnight. The spread revealed an indisputable yes, and this, paired with the first-hand experience still fresh in my mind, the pressure from the old cerebral spinal fluid erupted up my spinal column, tripping every chakra on the way up, and your humble author, narrator, and fictional character was lit up like a Christmas tree. The surge of energy that thrust its way up into the temple of my skull was filled with so much force that a roaring scream propelled itself from my mouth, vibrating every fiber of every muscle in my body and shaking every bone beneath them. In the center of my head, it felt as if a fabric had ripped itself from top to bottom, and 24 points around the circumference of my brain lit up, giving the sensation that I was being pulled up to the ceiling by the top of my head. Finally, this electric serpentine voltage made a crackling sound within, and I could feel that tiny gland just above my eyes pop with a release of liquidity. Afterwards, I was gone. My body had managed to stumble to my altar room, but yours truly was no longer here. Where I went is a tale for another time, but the experience many call the Kundalini had occurred, and finally, I could completely empathize with David Icke when he famously recalls his experience in saying, "The top of me bloody head blew off." This process translated me from any notion of being classified as a psychic and placed me squarely in the pneumatic category. Surely there is no doubt in my mind that you pneumatics reading this have similar stories and accounts of your breaking through to the other side. This also means you have no need of me to convince you that after this process you are in this world, but certainly not of this world. Not anymore, anyway. If thou knowest, thou knowest. What I want to return to here is the physical aspect. When you go through the Kundalini rising, there is a tremendous amount of physicality with it. In my experience, that physical component was finally triggered with the utilization of multiple symbolic images contained within a rectangle roughly 3 inches by 5 inches that I could hold in the palm of my hand. This ancient piece of what I believe is technology in the confines of a deck of tarot cards did things in my physical brain that set off a chain reaction, leading to me never being able to go back to the perception of this world I held prior. My very definition of what reality is had to be taken back to the drawing board after this experience and has never returned to form, which is a pretty enlightening piece of information when you consider the current state of the simulation's affairs. If you've come this far in this address, then here I will suggest some time to pause and percolate on the possibilities of where we're taking this. In the next part, we're going to take what we have discussed here and apply it to our original questions. Why are psychics subjected to perpetual apocalypse edging, and how is the simulation using the techniques of the tarot to keep them holding this reality up? Until then, Keep your sparks charged, Pneumatics.
This transmission of downloaded content is brought to you by CanaSense Total Wellness. In a civilization driven by overstimulation, synthetic attention, and algorithmic exhaustion, sometimes the oldest medicines still remember what humanity forgot. CanaSense Total Wellness is a nationwide cannabis collective focused on full-spectrum plant medicine for those seeking a more conscious path through the simulation. Recreational users 21 and older, along with medical members, are welcome in all 50 states. Membership is completely free to join. New members receive 25% off their first order. Flower concentrates, edibles, vapes, topicals, carefully selected for those attempting to reclaim their nervous system from the machine. Because not every problem requires another pharmaceutical. Not every wound can be healed by scrolling. And not every form of medicine comes in a synthetic package. Sometimes the body needs rest. Sometimes the mind needs stillness. Sometimes the spirit simply needs room to breathe. Visit canasense.com to learn more. And when joining, use downloaded content as your sponsor. That helps support independent media, future transmissions, and the continued exploration of consciousness, culture, and the strange reality we all seem to inhabit together. Or call toll-free 1-833-633-4208. CanaSense Total Wellness. CanaSense is common sense.
I've had plenty of years to ponder the technology of the tarot since that fateful evening 5 affirmative arcana completed the circuit within my column and crowned me. Plenty of years with an open third eye that we pneumatics know will never let you go back. Once you see beyond the veil, you may from time to time be able to turn the volume down, but you can never unsee what once was revealed. With more than 13 years walking this sphere with one foot in and the other foot out of how the masses perceive reality, comprehending exactly how the tarot facilitated my translation has required much imagination, because imagination is the only place the real answers lie. In my imaginings, I traveled all the way back to the last great reset some 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, when civilization seemingly sprang up all of a sudden, some people having more access to technology than others, at least an understanding of it anyway. Smart bets are on a global flood being the cause of the last great memory wipe of mankind, but who really knows? Regardless of what it was, as always, it was up to the pneumatics to hold and carry the gnosis from the prior epoch and transmit it to those seeking it on the other side of the great cataclysm. From ancient Egypt, I can see the string of vagabonds traveling from lands forever changed into new ones, shuffling their computer codes along the way into Europe, England, and Ireland, convincing inquisitive Hylix it was just a card game. What were these computer codes the gypsies embedded in the tarot? What purpose did their program execute when in the hands of a skillful reader? In my imaginings, it was to unlock memory on the collective level just as much as on the individual level. If the mind under the pressure of trauma shatters like glass into multiple compartmentalized shards, then surely the collective consciousness of a species or more would do the same after a global trauma. Identity and memory are slippery things after having been fractured, and from what I can tell, the purpose of the tarot, as code, is to reassemble that which was compartmentalized inside the mind. All the king's horses and all the king's men might not have been able to do it, but perhaps an occultist with a mean shuffle has a chance of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. So, from what I can see, tarot, when used properly and with adequate gnosis, fires and wires neural connections in the brain, which open up memory even down to the epigenetic level, which, if you think about it, could explain why a lot of people who utilize tarot are also familiar with and convinced of past lives and reincarnation. For those of you familiar with Assassin's Creed, this is a pretty easy concept to get your head around. If a person is the culmination of all the data collected from their ancestors, then accessing memories from those ancestors is just a matter of flipping some switches in the DNA, which could convince a person to experience the surfacing of those memories as a past life, rather than pulling up a file in the vast library of their genetic code. Then again, perhaps both possibilities are true, but I digress. In short, my experience and imaginings have brought me to the tentative conclusion that the technology of tarot is capable of both unlocking data in a genetic memory as well as locking data out, and we know how critical memory is to identity itself. Remember, Odin had two crows of wisdom and memory, giving preference to the latter. These are key components to godhood, one might conclude. Is the technology of tarot capable of more than opening and closing the doors to memory? Probably so. If the codification of symbols within tarot are able to physically manipulate a brain to dramatically affect how an individual perceives themselves and the reality they exist in via memory, surely it can fuck about with other aspects of the mind while in there. While it is beyond me, I do also believe that even the dimensions of 3 inches by 5 inches in their presentation plays a key role, but wouldn't presume to tell you why. I just have an unction that there is a deliberate purpose to such powerful technology being displayed in those dimensions, in both a deck of well-made tarot cards and the majority of smartphones. Even the interaction of swiping a set of symbols away from one's field of view is the same when you think about it. In the pursuit of our questions on how and why psychics are being subjected to apocalypse edging, we pneumatics must bring to mind why they are the object of our game to begin with. We must hold up what we've been given in the scriptures by pneumatics before us, side by side with our personal gnosis and experience in their cosmology, economy, and eschatology in regard to what psychics are and what they can do. When we do this and take a look around at the one piece of technology that has saturated the simulation over the past few decades in such a way that a generation or two is unable to recall a time when civilization itself was not built upon the existence of smartphones, it's a no-brainer to conclude they are the primary modality of control by the system and its archons. Their very design mimicking a deck of tarot cards on steroids, able to execute commands much faster and compact, make them the prime suspect for the how of our quest in this address. The fundamentals of Gnosticism inform us that the sparks of Sophia have been trapped in this Maya of matter we all play the game in, and in order to bring about her ultimate redemption, these sparks must make their way out of the Konoma, the very illusionary world the Demiurge was able to construct using their divine light from the Pleroma in both psychics and perhaps for a time from pneumatics. Yaldabaoth and the Archons cannot create ex nihilo, but we know they can manipulate that which is. We know that in the construction of this simulation, or Konoma, they were forced to fracture the light of Sophia in a myriad of shards that are psychics and pneumatics. They had to bend the light in their hall of mirrors to create all of this we currently find ourselves in. Generation after generation after generation of trauma serving as the fracturing of that light, again on the collective level as well as the individual level. Distorted perceptions of self and others are the mortar holding this prison planet / energy farm together brick by brick. The disassociated consciousness of Sophia was used to keep her in the trauma bond with Yaldabaoth. This is the great setup and design of the way things are here, as the Nag Hammadi and other scriptures inform us. Yet, as I discussed previously, it should go without saying that events in the realm unseen to Hylix have progressed beyond the accounts written down thousands of years ago. With free will, the story must go on from the narrative of our forebears left us, and while we pneumatics know and exist in this truth, this is not the case for psychics. As we monitor their acquisition of gnosis, we can see that for the most part, a large majority of them are just now dealing with the reality of the Demiurge and his archons. In online Gnostic spaces, nearly every account of them is being addressed from the present tense. This to me is a lockstep with the apocalypse edging lesser evolved psychics are running around in like a hamster wheel, which means someone or something is again playing a grand game of illusion to pull the wool over the eyes of the many. Miguel Connor, the host of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, often opens his show with the phrase, "Write your own gospel and live your own myth," which is, in my opinion, the very embodiment of what Gnosticism is. That small sentence has packed within it so much wisdom that when applied, it has the ability to cause spontaneous gnosis in a seeker. It promotes the same idea that Christ Yeshua taught, that being we are all joint heirs with him, we who are in Christ are Christ. We are not second fiddle bit players in the cosmic shadow of a carpenter's son the religionists try to sell us, but the stars of the show. We have every bit of the authority and ability to loose or bind the heavens he exhibited while incarnated here, which means we too serve as the logos, narrative instruments for the monad itself, more than capable of being the authors and finishers of our own particular faith, exactly as Miguel Connor beautifully puts it. Therefore, in 2017, I disposed of Yaldabaoth myself. I did away with the Demiurge and a majority of his archons around the time of the eclipse with little more than a blank composition book and a couple of Bic ballpoint pens. Not only did I find the job of writing that narrative for my experience thoroughly gratifying, but hilariously easy. With one completed journal utilizing a few rituals, altar work, and the implementation of Carl Jung's active imagination, your humble author, narrator, and fictional character brought down the Lush harvesting empire of the blind god, who shortly thereafter surrendered himself up to the aeons to get his celestial weapon in the woodshed of the galactic wormhole out back. His trial went as you would imagine it would go for a megalomaniacal entity parading around as the Most High, reigning over a creation he built on pain, suffering, and slavery, perpetually forcing the sparks of Sophia to reincarnate over and over to power his throne with Lush. Not too well for him. Not with all that heavy, dense, negative karma he had accumulated by his very own nature, while running a planet so filled with heartache and woe, it was enough to move the aeons to come down on him in judgment. Then he was sentenced. Then he was no more. The system he left behind running on autopilot, a car speeding down the freeway, whose driver had been raptured off, but not in a good way. Its very inertia would keep it running for a while, but ultimately the second law of thermodynamics was going to force the destruction of the simulation he made. In the interim was a vacuum of power throughout the spheres, just begging to be filled. But we shall get to that in time. At this juncture, you may be saying to yourself, but author, narrator, and fictional character, surely you are not saying that by means of writing a narrative for yourself, where the ancient hierarchy of Yaldabaoth ceased to exist, this actually changed the Gnostic cosmology that hasn't evolved since the Nag Hammadi library was so carefully tucked away, are you? To which I would respond, who cares? So long as that narrative I have the authority to pen by way of gnosis changed the cosmology for me, because it did. And you, as a pneumatic, have the sovereignty to enter into that narrative as well, which is what makes Gnosticism so fun to begin with. Let me put it another way. We pneumatics are aware that one of the many gems of gnosis you pick up along the way is that the mind creates and carves reality. It's much easier to have a head knowledge of that than it is to get a tangible grasp on controlling it. But surely in your studies, prayers, rituals, meditations, and metaphysical travels, sacrament-induced or not, it has been uncovered to you that thought plus the energy of emotion can most certainly manipulate the world around you. You also know that writing thoughts down so the observer can absorb those thoughts through your avatar's eyes allows the code of those thoughts to be planted in the subconscious like a nut that with patience will become an oak. Additionally, you are more than aware that magic itself is the process of bringing that which is an intangible thought within one's mind and through multiple interconnected actions spread out over any perceivable time, making that thought tangible or experienced through the avatar. You as a pneumatic also know these thoughts do not have to be limited to left brain origins, and the technique of active imagination is probably the most powerful tool at the practitioner's fingertips. That being said, even the Hylics can repeat the mantra of the kingdom of heaven is within, though they can never get a firm grip on what that even means. Even the woo-woo community are able to pump out content regularly about going within or doing shadow work. Any mystic worth their salt is fully informed that, as cliche as it may sound, you are never going to change a thing outside of yourself until you first get it done within yourself. This is especially appealing to Gnostics who prefer to interpret the information in the Nag Hammadi library as psychological or self-referential, meaning the Demiurge and his archons are actually internal forces one must confront and pass through to escape the Kenoma. How I chose to confront them within myself was through the means of active imagination and the written word, and lo and behold, my experience of the outside world did, in fact, reflect what was once just on the page. If the ultimate confrontation between a Gnostic and Yaldabaoth is all wonderful metaphors for confronting the ego within, and you have a metaphorical interpretation of the text, problem solved. However, if you take a more literal interpretation or hybrid interpretation, then guess what? Problem is also solved, because as within, so without, and as below, so above. It makes no difference to me if you other pneumatics drift into the post-Demiurge narrative I wrote or scribble your own. so much as it matters that you do indeed shift your consciousness beyond Yaldabaoth and the Archons. Overcoming the tyrannical hierarchy set up by the blind god seems to me to be one of the primary points of Gnosticism, and in that endeavor it can be very useful to compare notes, as I said in the beginning of this address. However, I have a solid unction that any pneumatic reading or hearing my words already knows on some level, either through intuition or by way of first-hand experiential knowledge, that cosmology has certainly changed. It must have, as events in the astral or ethereal worlds always trickles down through the spheres, eventually playing out here in the densest layer of chaos. To know that things above have drastically changed is as simple as taking a look down below, especially in the last decade or so. It's a shit show, and even the Hylics can see that. In my investigations, many of the answers I required took me to the words of Rudolf Steiner, who perhaps did not carry the title of Gnostic himself, but would certainly wear it from my perspective. I'll take Gnosis anywhere I can get it, even if you call it anthroposophy, and what he foresaw in the coming of Ahriman is certainly a puzzle piece that pulls the entire image together for me. Steiner, through his own methods of accessing the pleroma, knew enough that at some point in the future, an entity or egregore would emerge from the meddling of man and technology, which would mirror the cold, calculating methods of a mechanical mind we were building. Correction, built. If the actuality of artificial intelligence in our current experience echoes anything trickling down from the spheres, it announces a distinct change of the guards in this system, which should come as no surprise to us. When Zeus and the Olympians came to power, they first had to dispose of the Titans who ruled before them. At the lynch point of every cycle, there is the natural falling away of the powers that were to make way for the powers that will be. As Gnostics, we can all agree that Yaldabaoth and the Archons have been the bullies on the block for at least the last 5,000 to 6,000 years, running this joint as their loosh farm through primarily physical means. Wars, genocides, crusades, witch burnings, inquisitions, slavery, poverty, starvation, holocaust, all very hands-on approaches to squeezing the life force from a species you classify as food. Yet now we pneumatics can see a major shift in the cultivation of energy being streamlined more towards a digital smart slave camp. To me, this new reality screams Ahriman, who, if he wasn't an entity before, is most certainly a charged-up egregore now. And like Rudolf Steiner foresaw, Ahriman is aiming through nanotechnology and 6G singularities to incarnate one way or the other. And it seems simple enough to see that regardless of what you believe on the demise of the Demiurge, there is undoubtedly a new warden on the block in this new age. If this is the case, for we pneumatics to acknowledge that it is probably incumbent upon us to learn the new rules of the changing game. In the next section, we will begin to imagine this hypothetical scenario, that a consciousness we can agree to call Ahriman has risen in the back end of the simulation to fill the vacuum of power left by Yaldabaoth. And while we do this, we will attempt to comprehend what mechanics and motivations under his supervision would stay the same and which might change. One of the perks of existing in a post-Demiurge paradigm, as I do, is that I never really cared for the term louche. Nothing against Robert Monroe or his contributions in bringing Gnostic cosmology into the 20th century, but the word louche has always seemed a bit cartoonish to me, especially as a pneumatic who has, as Morpheus once implied, seen the fields with my own eyes. Having done so, I can testify that the last thing you want to do in describing what Yaldabaoth, the Archons, or their many acolytes were doing to mankind in the unseen is use phraseology that reduces any sense of horror from what it actually was. The process of stimulating a specific vibration of emotion through trauma, charging up to 11, and ultimately harvesting it from our backbones when viewed from the third eye is anything but cartoonish, believe me. If you yourself have taken the Enochian trip to the vibrational subterranean chambers where the human hamburger meat is made, then you are nodding in agreement. Because what you saw when you traveled down there paled in comparison to the worst shit Clive Barker ever put on the page. That place, outside of visible light, just lower than your current point of observation within hyperspace, where the spark of Sophia was shoved in and torn out of body after body after body in an unspeakable, perpetual rape in the most terrifying and indiscernible ways. Hell is far too tame a title to put upon that place where the archons enriched our life force for consumption without so much as time for them to wipe their mouths. That place from where the Demiurge pulled all his power was insatiable, merciless, cruel beyond measure, and ingenious in its invisible design. Every body that ever contained a spark of light within it ground up in the ethereal gears of a metropolis high on its addiction from human suffering. Suffice it to say, louche is certainly not the sound I would settle on to describe to you what myself, others, and Robert Monroe witnessed behind the veil. Nevertheless, when I say louche, you, dear reader, have a generalized idea of the type of energy harvesting I'm describing. A psychic would have a head knowledge of this, and a pneumatic a first-hand experiential knowledge, which is what I believe is one of the dividing lines between the two. The psychics who are learning about these things file it under things I now know, whereas pneumatics file it under holy fuck of God, it's real, and it's paramount that I get to doing something to put a stop to it. One class knows about it. The other class has experienced it. The latter have no choice after their visit than to climb the tree of Sephiroth and descend the roots of Clipoff toot sweet to amass the level of experience required to finally get into the cosmic game in any meaningful or effective way. From apprentice to sorcerer or from poet to bard, the title a pneumatic carries after their Flammarion translation makes no never mind. You just know after its reality is bestowed upon you that something must be done, and you have a responsibility to play a part in that something using everything you have at your disposal, and if it isn't enough, a duty to attain more. Which is the reason I became a wizard, a manipulator of forces, an occultist of the kindest sorts, the fool and the tarot and the emperor as well, initiated from one batshit crazy thing to another, and rubbing shoulders with magicians of every sort and every rank or file. Wiggled with witches from sea to shining sea too, and after a long career in the esoteric, I can tell you this, every bit of all that stuff is but trinkets in a toy box to a pneumatic that knows all they need is a white blank page and a little bit of ink to go a long way. After attaining such a level of the Logos, everything else becomes props for show. Not that we can't play pretend with wand or ritual to help a psychic along their way, but when you are in the actual etheric trenches, it's all about the word. If greater education on this topic is required, I will kindly refer you to the wisdom of one Grant Morrison and the near omnipotence of the hypersigil technique. As I said before, your humble author, narrator, and fictional character entered into the post-Demiurge age circa 2017, but I have no doubt the date to the doorway some of you walked through will range from probably 2012 to 2020 or so. Doesn't really matter, because at the point where any pneumatic does, you're screwing around with the whole time-space, space-time fabric, so it's really experienced as more of a plane, to be honest. Which means that, yes, while you exist in an age past the demise of the Demiurge, others in your reality or observations can still be living at the height of his reign simultaneously. Think of a temporal duck on top of the water, graceful above the line but kicking like a son of a bitch beneath. Now, supposing you, dear reader and fellow pneumatic, have moved into the post-Demiurge age by whatever method worked for you, it goes without saying that some distinctions must be made from what was to what now is. The first of which I would like to address is the differences you've noticed from louche extraction to whatever this new form of harvesting is by the Ahrimanic system. Louche, stimulated, cultivated, and extracted by the archons and their acolytes, was very dense, heavy, slow-moving from about the mid-chakras downward. While not exclusively dependent on physical suffering, it tended to lean more in that direction than what we are experiencing under the Ahrimanic system. This new extraction is by far much more mental and concentrated on what is going on in the mind, though again, not with exclusivity. These differences bring me to the opinion that an altogether different term should be used in the place of louche, and if Robert Monroe felt confident enough to coin his own term, then I see no issue with me following suit. After giving it considerable thought, I fell on the completely made-up word chrism, which sounds like the real word chrism, but it's not, because I made it up. And whereas chrism has its own definition, you're free to look up, chrism will be defined in the context of the form of energy Ahriman is fiending for moving forward in this address. Chrism is moving from the mid chakras upward into the crown, where I'm thoroughly convinced its primary substance of extraction is, in fact, imagination. The crude oil of Yaldabaoth might have been the thick trauma of our minds and bodies, but Ahriman is far more interested in the very inkwell of magic itself, in that raw power of divinity within the power of creation in the right brain activity. The infrastructure of this simulation was maintained by the Demiurge sitting upon his Saturnian throne through the manipulation of subatomic particles with the heaviness of Louche. Ahriman, on the other hand, is using an altogether different technique we discussed previously, in that the chrism he is extracting from his servers in psychics is the current underpinning of what we are observing as reality. As you've no doubt concluded, rather than swarms of demi-archons extracting loose from beyond the visible light out of the backbones of wee sparks, Ahriman already has a legion of deployed extractors we see a zombified humanity walking around with all the time in their palms. His greatest tool is the algorithm, and through curated apps posing as news sources and fooling mankind into thinking they are staying informed, Ahriman is hitting psychics from every angle, with Armageddon after Armageddon narrative to continue perpetually this apocalypse edging. Through the imaginative power of those connected to the pleroma, the agenda of our newest adversary is to maintain a constant environment of the end, where his targets either succumb to hopelessness or cling to the coming of some outside savior or more, both of which neutralize the probability of those who can, creating a reality other than the one currently serving Ahriman. If there's anything to be said about revelation of the method, all one needs to do is ponder the term doom scrolling in light of this gnosis to get a clear understanding of exactly what's going on. In the age of Ahriman, the entire agenda is contained in those two words coupled together. Prophets of old would script in scrolls for the higher beings that employed them, and in the consciousness of the collective would in turn make the scribbles reality. In our current era, the infinite scroll of social media platforms is inundating the minds of psychics with a script of Ahriman's choosing also. Acting as a peer-to-peer network, the combined power of their imagination is creating and sustaining a society and or civilizations that are constantly teetering on the brink of oblivion, but never falling off. This makes for a very fruitful chrism farm if I've ever seen one. Why imagination? Why would Ahriman choose to harvest this frequency over the tried and true method of emotion that Yaldabaoth was so fond of? Though this address is aimed at pneumatics, I won't assume that every pneumatic has walked a magical path or initiated themselves in some form of sorcery or other system. For those that haven't, it must be understood that regardless of if one practices witchcraft, voodoo, necromancy, chaos magic, or any other form of harnessing forces, if imagination is not the foundation, the magic is simply not there. As I said before, magic itself is the ability to take that which is intangible in the mind and through interconnected actions bring it into one's experience. The fancy words, wands, rituals, or other aesthetics are merely there to strengthen the focus of the practitioner's imagination. Visualization, or imagination, plus vibration, or emotion, equals manifestation. The clearer the visualization and the more intense the vibration means the faster and greater the manifestation will be. This is the heart of all magic. Under the rule of the Demiurge, concepts like this and Gnostic texts such as the Nag Hammadi Library were not so easily known or accessible, so monopolizing imagination wasn't too much of a priority. He had that on lockdown with inquisitions, witch trials, and book burnings courtesy of the Roman Catholic Empire. But times have changed, and with the advent of the internet and the Gnostic revival exploding after the 1940s, orthodoxy is no longer the bit and bridle it once was. Rather than trying to suppress the information from psychics on reality manipulation, Ahriman's tactic has instead been to hijack it. He has flooded the zone, as it were, and convinced an entire generation that they all have had some spiritual awakening, when in actuality, they are confusing their spiritual awakening with simply being on the internet. The algorithm, spoon-feeding Hylix a series of short-form content on chakras, energy healing, third-eye meditation techniques, or other metaphysical information, does not constitute what one would identify as an actual spiritual awakening. It is simply saturating the NPC population with the lingo and look of spirituality, to isolate and diminish the full capabilities of the psychics, who feel small and at the mercy of some new age ocean that tosses them about with its own gimmicks and money back guarantees. The handheld digital tarot deck Aramon weaponized has them buying into narratives spit out by the celebrity gurus of the week, waiting in anticipation for some timeline shift or great rescue from a galactic federation of light that only communicates with channelers who make a living doing guess what? Fucking channeling. That's what. While their imaginative power is locked into these algorithmic fairy stories, the top YouTube channels or personalities are hypnotizing them in the suggestion that whatever is a coming is just over the horizon. Psychics who actually hold the power to craft reality do just that. They keep the culmination of whatever they are waiting for just over the horizon, again and again and again, day after day after day, swipe after swipe after swipe. All the while, Aramon feeds, his coffers being filled with chrism that allows him the power to sustain our current simulation to his specifications. So, where do we pneumatics go from here? How do we pluck ourselves from the Ouroboros of apocalypse edging Aramon has the psychics generating with all his glossy dopamine drip feeds? What can we do to effectively assist in the redemption of Sophia's sparks and psychics in this new age of Aramon? I think the first thing is the most obvious, and that is to ensure that we ourselves have not wandered into the digital quicksand that pulls psychics back into the chaos of Konoma. Before attempting to put our hand out to those we came here to assist, we must ensure that under the new rules of the simulation post Demiurge, we pneumatics have untethered ourselves from Aramon's tendrils. I won't go into some exhaustive exposition on the evils of technology or bore you with information you already know regarding how detrimental a lot of this stuff on our devices is to the brain and body. You do not need me to convince you, as you are already well aware, that doom scrolling is exactly how it sounds and is doing a number on the nervous system of users that can clearly be seen in society itself as it lemmings its way off a cliff. The human body we find ourselves in was not designed to receive the amount of input it does at the speed it does, and we aren't going to pretend that the apparent direction all this is going in is not some Borg-like hive mind. It is abundantly clear that's the end game of Aramon. For proof, all one needs to do is go out in public and observe the uniformity of the masses and downward gaze and upheld glowing hand. It isn't practical for me to suggest that we go off grid or renounce technology either, as chances are this information is probably arriving to your awareness via the systems of subject. The response need not be so extreme. The response, I think, does need to be disciplined, though. I think as pneumatics, we must become and remain very mindful of how these systems Aramon is using affect us mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically, with honesty, and set strict boundaries on how much we use them and for what purposes. In my opinion, the best way to gauge this thus far is to set a date to begin a digital detox and plan to unplug from all these curated conversation apps for no less than 1 week. Once initiated, take notes on your sleep patterns, emotions, thoughts, and productivity. Basically, get a good idea of how much you have already been hindered by even casual usage of TikTok, the Bilbos of TikTok, as it were. Afterwards, adjust your exposure accordingly. We pneumatics must remove from our eyes first that which is needful to be removed from the eyes of psychics. We must not be lulled into the slumber or seduction that these systems can be utilized in a casual way any longer. To do so is akin to a rabid alcoholic convincing himself that no more will follow the first drink. This same point of view must be adopted in the temptation to scroll for Aramon. While this may sound like I'm saying complete abstinence, it's not quite what I mean. Rather, when we pneumatics engage with a 3-inch by 5-inch digital deck of tarot, we must do it with full awareness of what it is and what it can do. Mindfulness and intention are key here. While pulling away from notions of casual use from these systems, we must balance our actions with reclamation of our own imagination, our own creativity, our own ability to craft narrative, and through the power of imagination, bring that narrative to life. This can be done through writing, painting, playing music, or any other act of physical involvement with creation. We have to remind ourselves of the sheer magic and power there is in holding something in our minds and through will bringing it out into the world. Then, when we have reaffirmed this power within ourselves, we are able to effectively communicate our gnosis to the psychics being used by the system to create this shit show we all find ourselves swimming in. The goal is to enlighten psychics to the knowledge that all the world is indeed a stage. Somehow or another, we must get them to perceive that the nonstop noise of the world that is seducing them into holding images of horrible outcomes is very much like a stage magician's parlor tricks. The 24-hour news cycle is Aramon's sleight of hand that makes them not only participants in his narrative, but the active generators of it. The more they bombard their thoughts with the wars, plagues, the famines, the genocides, the scarcity, the injustices, and Donald Trump's fat fucking face, the more solidified in the material world these things become. As far-fetched as it may be for so many of them to comprehend, their imaginings of these things with emotion is the projector that is casting it all upon the screen. The chrism they create, and Aramon craves, is the lifeblood of the new simulation that solidifies any given state of affairs. We can no longer afford to continue playing the Yaldabaoth Lush farm game if we desire to exit the dead world of apocalypse edging discussed in the first part of this series. When we were operating in that paradigm, the name of the game was identifying Sophia's sparks and psychics and delivering to them the gnosis they required to shed off as much of their mortal coil as possible and begin operating in their own pneuma. If we wish to be reinvigorated with that sense of purpose that once filled our etheric lungs after awakening, we must accept and operate under the guidelines of a completely new game. It is no longer about making the masses aware of a Demiurge and his archons running a prison planet. That proverbial cat is now completely out of the bag. Our task is to push the narrative past that and fully into the new age of Aramon we have stumbled into, mostly unaware. Which brings me neatly into the final scribbles of this series addressed to Pneumatics able to receive it. When we began this State of the Simulation address, we opened with yours truly lamenting that post-storyline completion, the vast world of Grand Theft Auto 5 had become a ghost town, while still being visibly populated with NPCs and having tons of side quests left to complete, even with plenty to still do in Los Santos. Without a narrative being driven forth in a significant way, it all just felt like thumb twiddling. As a gamer who uses the medium for more therapeutic reasons over requirements for entertainment, this left me with a very obvious solution to the dull existence in a simulated world that had no more appeal or purpose for me. Hit eject, use the disc as a drink coaster, never to return, and slide a whole new world into my magic game box, which is exactly what I did. Shortly after beginning this series, I decided that in my leisure time, I would enter the simulated world of Red Dead Redemption 2, which, as you gamers are aware, is also developed by Rockstar Games. And while GTA 5 and RDR 2 are two vastly different games, you can still see the fingerprints of the former designers all over the latter. The attention to detail is flawless, the graphics and visual effects are like interacting with a moving portrait, the in-game physics are grounded and make sense to the type of story it immerses you in. The open world is massive and seemingly alive as you gallop across hills, plains, mountains, snowfields, hamlets, and cities galore. The story is enthralling, human, and well voiced by each character you meet in the western frontier of 1899. There is no doubt that the digital artists who brought Los Santos to life put all their passion into the story of Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption 2, striving to bring the player into an experience that could feel like a second skin. Yet with all the two games have in common, you realize well into the early hours that you are dealing with a completely different simulation altogether from Grand Theft Auto 5. As Arthur Morgan, the gunslinger protagonist, you can still enact the dirtiest criminal deeds if you so wish. However, the world does not reward you as it would in GTA 5 for this type of gameplay. Rather, the world and its inhabitants tend to make your experience much lighter if you move your avatar around that world with more honor than villainy. The object of the game is not to amass a fortune through the establishment of a criminal empire built on stolen cars and armed deals gone bad, but to simply survive and cohabit an untamed frontier as best you can with others. Again, while there are some similarities, the motivations to lose yourself in the story are almost diametrically different. One world is built for speed. The other is meant to slow you down. Take your time. Enjoy the environment you find yourself in. And I love this. I suppose What this state of the simulation address has sought out to do is invite ye other pneumatics to join me in an endeavor to acknowledge a different game, learn its rules, and play it correctly, rather than how we have been accustomed. Believe me, if the masses are discussing Yaldabaoth, the Archons, and the reality of the soul harvesting mechanism in the spheres, if this is the common narrative being played out by Hylix, we pneumatics ought to know we gonna be on some different shit, which means we must adjust our gnosis and its application to the age of Ahriman while using the disc of the Demiurge as our new drink coaster. Until next time, keep your chrism clean.
This has been downloaded content. Want more pneumatic dialogue like this? Subscribe to the DLC newsletter at downloadedcontent.com. And be sure to follow across YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, and BitChute. See you on the next transmission.